It is with a lot of pleasure I get to welcome Con Coughlin, who's the author of many books that cover the gamut from Jerusalem, the Bush-Blair relationship, Khomeini's successors in Iran, and most recently his new book, Churchill's First War, Young Winston at War with the Afghans, which has received great reviews in the United Kingdom and is beginning to get good reviews over here, just recently published. Con is a journalist and author. He's the defense editor of the Daily Telegraph, which is the largest circulation newspaper in Britain and one of the largest circulation newspapers in the world. He dedicated his book to John Keegan, who of course is one of the great historians of war and was Con's predecessor as defense editor of the Telegraph. So Con has a very distinguished career. He's also my brother-in-law.
Hence the very nice words.
So it's really a great pleasure to welcome here my sister Catherine, my mother, who's also here. So thank you, Con.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for that very warm welcome. And it's a great pleasure to be here at the New America Foundation. I'm going to talk about Churchill's First War. Churchill's First War is, in my view, a neglected but rather fascinating period in the development of Winston Churchill as a war leader. I think a lot of us have seen films about young Winston and read about young Winston, and our minds immediately skip to his exploits in South Africa, escaping from prison and making a big international name for himself and going into Parliament, which of course was always his first ambition. But the period that preceded all that really started on the Afghan border in the 1890s. And if we can get the PowerPoint up and running, because I've got some quite good illustrations of this whole period.
Go to the podium.
Go to the podium, right, okay. New technology, so start.
Yes. Good point. We've never done this before.
Right, let's start at the beginning. So this is actually the cover of the British book. But it's important for my talk because, as I said, when we think of Churchill as a young man, we tend to think of South Africa. We forget about his 6-week stay fighting on the Afghan border in 1897. And when I started my research, I had a look back at Carl Foreman's film, Young Winston. And basically there's one scene at the start of the film, which includes this picture of young Winston on a grey, a white horse. And it sort of sums up what Churchill was all about at the age of 22. The senior officer turns to his aide-de-camp and says, "Who's that bloody fool on the grey?" And the young officer replies, "Someone who wants to get noticed, I imagine." And the general says, "He'll get noticed. He'll get his bloody head blown off." So what was young Winston Churchill doing, sitting on a grey in the Hindu Kush in 1897? Well, I think first of all, let's start with his family, because again, people forget that when young Winston set off on this life of high adventure, his family's fortunes were in a rather parlous state. This is Winston as a young boy, his brother Jack, and his mother Jenny. His mother Jenny was something of a society beauty and became estranged from her husband, Lord Randolph, during the course of their marriage. And I suppose today would be described as a grande horizontale. She had, amongst many of her friends, the Prince of Wales, and had a rather active social life, to put it mildly. And young Winston had a rather neglected childhood. Mary Soames, Churchill's granddaughter, once remarked that even by the standards of their generation, Churchill had a very neglected childhood. He very rarely saw his parents. And particularly Lord Randolph, while his wife was gallivanting around London, he managed to develop syphilis, from which he died in 1895, the year that Winston Churchill passed out from Sandhurst. So not only did the family have a rather difficult reputation in British society, they're also broke, which didn't really help young Winston as he set about life. Here's young Jenny Churchill in a rather seductive pose. And despite his mother's antics, young Winston remained utterly devoted to her throughout his life, which is a great help to me as a writer, because he wrote constantly to her from the Afghan border of all his exploits, some boastful, but also some very revelatory about what he was experiencing on the northwest frontier. At the time Lord Randolph died in 1895, Churchill was just finishing at Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy, where young British soldiers are trained. But Churchill had had such a poor schooling, he was so academically behind, that he even struggled to get into Sandhurst. In the late Victorian era, boys that weren't too bright, who weren't going to university, who weren't going into the professions, were basically put in what they called the army class and prepared for a life in the military. Now, of course, we all know that military men are very fine and upstanding and very clever. But dear old Churchill, as a teenager, as I said, it took him 3 attempts to get into Sandhurst. But Sandhurst was the making of him. And again, you see in the letters and his accounts of the time that even as a young man here in his cadet uniform, he had a very clear view of the course his life was going to take. He wanted to have a very distinguished military career. He wanted to win medals and glory fighting on the frontiers of the British Empire. But a military career was not all he sought. What he wanted to do was to win these medals, and in this great phrase he came up with, beat them into an iron dispatch box. He wanted a military career to lay the foundations for a life in politics, and to basically make up for the rather frustrated political career of his father. And even at Sandhurst, on his days off, he would go to the House of Commons and listen to the great statesmen of the day, Gladstone, etc. He would read his father's speeches. So even when he was about to set off on a life of high adventure in the Hindu Kush, he thought that having this kind of background was what he said was the perfect foundation for a political life. I should also just remind you just the kind of gusto with which Churchill at 21, 22 approached his military career. He wrote what I think is one of his best lines as a young man. "Nothing in life is so exhilarating as to be shot at without result." And I think any of us who've been in a war zone would heartily approve of that sentiment. So, Churchill comes out of Sandhurst, the family's broke, what to do? First of all, he joins one of the smartest cavalry regiments of the British Army, the Queen's Fourth Own Hussars. They fought with distinction with the Duke of Wellington in the Peninsular Wars, probably less so in the charge of the Light Brigade in which they participated, but they were regarded as a very smart cavalry regiment. And Winston, again, showing this sort of determination to get ahead, actually overruled his father's wish. His father's dying wish was that he should go into an infantry regiment because it was basically cheaper. If you went into a cavalry regiment, you had to pay for the horses and the tackle and the stabling. But Winston loved the uniforms. He just loved the idea. It's even better in the cover of the book. As you'll see, it's in colour. It's a very smart uniform, and he thought, well, if I'm going around the salons of London, people will notice me, and I'll have a chest full of medals. And again, this is very much in his mind's eye. So Churchill joined his cavalry regiment, and the other attraction of the Queen's Fourth Own Hussars was it was shortly due to deploy to India, one of the jewels in the British Empire's crown, and of course the country that abutted Afghanistan and all that meant. Now, a brief little history lesson just to sort of catch up on where we were with the Afghans in the 1890s. I think here we have a magic thing. This line here is basically what we know as the Durand Line. It runs for 1,500 miles between the Hindu Kush and the coastal plain. And it was established in 1895 by a British civil servant called Mortimer Durand. And it was arbitrarily implemented through the tribal lands of the Pashtun community, who I'm sure most of you know live on in the Afghan mountain range that lies between modern Pakistan and Afghanistan. And a bit like the Israeli security fence that was established in the West Bank a few years ago, this line was arbitrarily established. It was established because during the course of the Victorian era, Britain had had two quite disastrous military campaigns in Afghanistan in the 1830s and the 1880s, as a result of which the politicians in London had basically concluded, and this was a cross-party decision, that never again would we set foot in Afghanistan. It was too costly and too difficult. What we'll do is we will set up a border and we will keep the Afghans in their place, and if they venture down and threaten the British Empire, then we will send them back. The other subtext to this, of course, was the British government was always concerned that the authorities in Kabul, the Emir, Abdurrahman, would form a relationship with Moscow or Tehran and link up with one of these powers, and one of these powers would use Afghanistan to attack Britain. So that was a sort of the geopolitical subtext to all this. But so far as Winston was concerned, this was the border, and as a result of the establishment of this border, not surprisingly, the Pashtun tribes were in revolt. Again, a bit like today, I'm not going to labour the parallels with the modern campaign too much, but if I say that a network of Wahhabi-trained mullahs wandered through the tribal areas, so all along here, it's gone off, along here, further down you've got Waziristan round here, but these names are all very familiar. The Mahmud Valley, the Lower Swat Valley, all these areas were susceptible to Wahhabi-trained mullahs who persuaded the local tribesmen, who were already infuriated by the division of their lands and the unwarranted intervention of a foreign force in their affairs, to revolt against the British. And the first major revolt occurred in 1895 at the border town of Churchill, where a small British garrison, and I think we have a picture now of, this is the relief of Churchill, a print drawn up by a British officer who was caught up in the siege. But basically for about 3 weeks, the small British garrison of about 100 men were besieged by hundreds of tribesmen who staged repeated assaults. Again, in the regimental records of the siege, one officer writes forlornly how food was so short they had to kill all the polo ponies, salt them, and eat them. And this actually was probably the worst moment of the whole campaign, as far as they were concerned. But as a result of the Churchill assault, the British decided that they would set up a network of garrisons along the border. The front lines would be forts, and then there would be these big supply depots in the rear to get reinforcements up in an emergency. And one of these supply depots, by the way, was Abbottabad, which, of course, my brother-in-law has written about extensively in another context. One of the forts we decided to build was at a place called Malakand. And this is a portrait of the British and then what they described as their native comrades in arms, mapping out the Malakand Pass where the fort was to be built. Work started on the fort in 1896, and not surprisingly, the local tribesmen thought this was yet another example of the British trying to subjugate them, and not soon afterwards there was a major revolt directed at Malakand. Now, Churchill, meanwhile, has been sent with his regiment down to the southern tip of India, to Bangalore, about as far removed from the action on the northwest frontier as it's possible to be. And again, he was quite intemperate in his demands that he should not be sent to this remote outpost of empire, but to the heart of action where he could win medals. And despite the best efforts of his mother and her movements around the salons of London society, she couldn't persuade the head of the British Army to change his deployment. And again, when you look at the records of the British regiments who served in southern India, quite a few young officers of that generation died, but they died not fighting the wily Pashtun, but trying to kill tigers and boar sticking and chasing elephants and things like that. Churchill was rather bored, and in his frantic efforts before deploying to India to get to the action, he ran into this brilliant general, General Sir Bindon Blood. Now, General Blood was one of the heroes of frontier warfare. He'd fought with General Roberts during the very desperate campaign to save the British mission in the 1880s. Again, he's written his own book on his campaign, and reading General Blood's accounts of his campaigns, it's as though he was involved in some glorious fox hunt. But of course, it was very dangerous. Churchill met General Blood at a dinner party in London before he went to India, and got the old general to promise him that if ever there was any more trouble on the frontier, he would get Churchill up to fight with him. Fast forward to the summer of 1897, when the first attacks on Malakand started. Churchill was at the Goodwood races in Sussex when he read in his paper that there was trouble on the frontier, and that General Blood had been appointed to command the Malakand field force. And here's this brilliant picture. There's General Blood in the middle there with his wonderful moustache, and the senior officers of the British Raj with a splendid cannon, the mountains of the Afghan border in the background, the scene for their fantastic and rather terrible campaign that was to come. Churchill was so desperate to get out there and make a name for himself that he just cabled Blood from Victoria Station before jumping on a train all the way back to India. It took 3 weeks by boat train, or train and boat, to get to India. And all the way along the route, again, you get Churchill's diaries, and he's getting very, very angry that the general has not replied to his cable demanding that he honour his pledge to take Churchill on his staff. And Blood, of course, has disappeared off into the valleys of the Afghan border, basically to try and subdue the tribes that had instigated the attack against Malakand. If I tell you, in the course of that first campaign, one of the villages that they subdued was called Mindora. Mindora is the village where Malala Yousafzai, the Pakistani schoolgirl who was shot for trying to get girls educated in Pakistan, that's where she comes from. This is just a very light example of the overlay between where Churchill was fighting and the modern campaign. Again, if you were to get a map of all the CIA drone strikes that have taken place on Pakistan's northern border with Afghanistan, they relate pretty closely to the villages, tribes and villages where Churchill and his British compatriots fought in 1897. That is how closely this landscape matches the modern conflict. Churchill finally gets a reply from Bindon Blood. There's no space on the staff for a soldier, but why don't you come up as a newspaper correspondent? And in those days, the British Army and Fleet Street had hit on this very happy alliance, where Fleet Street got young officers with a basic education to write dispatches, rather than have to go to the exorbitant cost of sending foreign correspondents with all their bar bills and hotel bills off on lengthy journeys. And of course, if anything happened to said young officer, then it was the Army's responsibility and not Fleet Street. And in fact, this relationship lasted until W.S. Churchill started writing some dispatches for the Daily Telegraph in 1895, and Lord Kitchener, one of the senior commanders of the time, was so outraged that a second lieutenant should be publicly criticising the commanders that he ordered the practice to stop, and it's never been repeated. These days generals have to retire from duty before they put pen to paper. Churchill wanted to write for the Times, which in my view, of course, is a rather inferior product. But the editor of the Times at that time, George Buckle, had been involved with Churchill's father, Lord Randolph, during his resignation scandal, and didn't really want any more Churchills, thank you very much. So the Daily Telegraph took him on. And Churchill wrote 15 dispatches of this campaign during his 6 weeks running around there. As a former foreign editor at the Telegraph, I must say, his copy is actually very, very good. It's very bright. And unlike a lot of some of the best foreign correspondents I've come across in the Middle East, he wasn't always at the scene of the action, despite writing rather brilliant and florid reports of what was going on. But that's a little Fleet Street trick that we'll skip over. It took Churchill 5 days to get from Bangalore in southern India up to Malakand, and he fretted all the way. In his diaries and his letters to his mother, there's this constant correspondence. He thinks, oh, the fates are against me, I'll never get there, it'll all be over, no glory for Churchill, no medals, no fame. And when he got to Malakand, the fort was deserted because they're all out campaigning. Churchill, absolutely exhausted after the journey, the final bit in a horse and cart that took 5 hours in the heat of an Indian summer, he goes into the mess and says, can I have a drink? And the mess barman says, well, I'm afraid all we have, sir, is a whiskey and soda. He says, well, that's a rather inferior drink. Us Churchills only drink brandy. And he said, well, that's all we've got, sir. Lump it or take it. And so Churchill had his first whiskey and soda, and his lifelong affection for this drink started in September 1897 in Malakand. The party returns, blood returns, they've taken serious casualties. There is now room on the campaign for Churchill to be both a warrior and a writer. Or as he writes quite memorably, I became a knight of pen and sword. In those days when officers were killed in action, rather than send the effects home, they just had a field auction so that fellow officers could benefit from the loss of their brothers in arms. Churchill went to an auction, and it was there that he purchased his grey horse, his white horse. Not realising the reason it was up for sale in the first place is that such a conspicuous beast made him a prime target for the Pashtun tribesmen. But Churchill, as I said, was determined to make a name for himself, and by buying this lovely white horse, the grey, he thought, if he does see action, then the senior officers will be sure to see him in action and reward him appropriately, with all the implications that would have for his later career. By the time Churchill got there, the fighting had got pretty serious. The main river crossing to Malakand was a fort called Chakdara, which is now commemorated with a great memorial to Churchill. And the fighting at Chakdara, as at Chitral, was pretty intense. The small British garrison, overwhelmed by hundreds of tribesmen, and literally fighting for their lives, running out of ammo, and in a very desperate situation until finally the relief forces came up from Peshawar and succeeded in relieving Chakdara, and then later Malakand. These are the officers at the Malakand fort posing after they successfully repelled the Pashtun tribesmen. And as you can see, they're a mixture of British and native officers, primarily Indian Sikhs. I think during most of the Victorian era, the British Army was 2/3 Sikh and 1/3 British. A bit like today, a lot of what we would today know as insurgents didn't take much care for their own safety and security. Inspired by their mullahs, they were almost on a suicide mission. And again, the British officers were trained at Sandhurst before the days of proper photography to sketch the scenes of battle. And these pictures are drawn by a Major Hobday, who was part of Churchill's component. And you can see that they're dressed in white. They're ready for martyrdom. They've got their flags, they're banging their drums. Very few of them are armed. And they were literally marched like this towards the walls of the fort, where a lot of them would be killed. I mean, the ratio of dead to British dead was 10 to 1. In fact, Hilaire Belloc, the Victorian poet, came up with this rather ironic little ditty about the superiority of British arms at the time. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not. A bit like the Taliban today, and not to labour the point too much, but I think most people would appreciate that the Taliban movement is drawn exclusively from the Pashtuns of the mountain ranges. Apart from the more excitable mullahs, the majority of the tribesmen preferred guerrilla tactics. And so rather than engage the British in direct action, they would look at them, observe them, and then attack them when the moment was right. And one of their favourite tactics was to fire on the British encampments when they were sleeping at night, so that the British soldiers got no rest. And Churchill writes very eloquently of lying under the stars of the Afghan passes, and the stars twinkling like Piccadilly Circus, while all around bullets are whizzing over his head, fired by the tribesmen in the hills. So Churchill sets off to the Moman Valley to start his campaign. The Moman Valley was one of the valleys that had taken part in the original attack on Malakand, and the British tactics were fairly brutal. They would go to a village, and if there was no parley, if the villagers would not submit, then the village was burnt to the ground, or the crops were burnt to the ground, and the menfolk taken into custody. And this went on all the way through the valleys of that region. And it's not really an exaggeration to say that the people Churchill was fighting were the great-great-grandfathers of the Taliban. And in fact, Churchill himself, as I said, even though he'd never been to Afghanistan, and during the course of his adventures here, never actually set foot in Afghanistan, he became an instant expert on the Taliban and these ferocious tribesmen, as he said. And he writes very eloquently, this is from one of his first dispatches for the Daily Telegraph, about what he called, in the Victorian age, they were known as the Talib al-Ulams. And Churchill viewed them, quote, as degraded a race as any on the fringe of humanity, fierce as a tiger, but less cleanly, as dangerous, but not so graceful. He blamed the Talibs for the Afghans' lamentable absence of civilized development, keeping them in what he called the grip of miserable superstition. But he was particularly repelled by the Talibs' loose moral conduct. He wrote that they live free at the expense of the people, and more than this, they enjoy a sort of droit de seigneur, and no man's wife or daughter is safe from them. Of some of their manners and morale, it is impossible to write. Well, you can imagine the impact that made on the breakfast tables in London when the Daily Telegraph came through the letterbox. But the fighting had got very serious. And the serious point about Churchill's First War is when we think of Churchill as the great war leader and the way he conducted himself and the humanity he always displayed, I think you just have to look back at his very personal and bitter experiences fighting up on the territories. And probably the most dangerous moments came on the 16th of September 1897, when he took part in a raid on the village of Shahi-Tangi. Again, if you Google Shahi-Tangi, you'll see it's been the subject of some drone strikes in recent years. But Shahi-Tangi was said to have taken part in the attack on Malakand. It had to be punished. And so Churchill was part of a company-strong detachment that went up to Shahi Tangi. It meant a 3-day climb basically up a hillside. So he had to dismount from his beloved grey, which caused him initially some anxiety. But I think by the end of the day he was rather relieved he wasn't quite so conspicuous, because once they got to Shahi Tangi, they found it deserted. The tribesmen had disappeared, which is yet again one of the tactics that's familiar today. But they noticed that watching from the hills, the British had overrun the protection of the mountain batteries. And so as the British, having set fire to the village and the crops, started to withdraw, suddenly the whole hillside sprang to life as hundreds of tribesmen descended on this isolated British party. Churchill was given responsibility for providing covering fire for the main party as they retreated. And the plan was to retreat in 3 stages down the hill. So the main party would retreat to the second part, then Churchill and his little group would once the coast was clear, retreat. And it was on the second stage of this retreat that Churchill really came close to getting himself killed. It's probably best to just read a little extract of Churchill's own account, because it is very gripping. The rest of our party got up and turned to retreat. There was a ragged volley from the rocks, shouts, exclamations, and a scream. I thought for a moment that 5 or 6 of our men had laid down again. So they had, 2 killed and 3 wounded. 1 man shot through the breast and pouring with blood. Another lay on his back, kicking and twisting. The British officer was spinning around just behind me, his face a mass of blood, his right eye cut out. Yes, it was certainly an adventure. And in this one moment, you see this gung-ho, bumptious young subaltern coming face to face with the horror of modern conflict, something that stayed with Churchill for the rest of his days. During the course of his engagements during the 6-week period, as he later boasted to his mother, he came under fire 10 complete times, and on 3 occasions came very close to getting himself killed. In fact, another very poignant moment from Churchill's experiences during this period came when a very good friend of his, William Brown Clayton, an old Etonian subaltern like himself who'd become very friendly with Churchill, he was killed in a later engagement on the 30th of September. And again, you see the humanity of young Winston coming through here when he wrote to his mother, I very rarely detect genuine emotion in myself, but I must rank as a rare instance the fact that I cried when I met the Royal West Kents on the 30th of September and saw the men really unsteady under fire and tired of the game, and that poor young officer, Brown Clayton, literally cut to pieces on a stretcher. This was the reality of war, and it made a burning and lasting impression on Winston Churchill. And when you go through to the Second World War and his aversion to mass casualties, his reluctance to sanction the D-Day landings because he thought there would be a bloodbath on the beaches of Normandy, you could argue it all comes back to these very raw experiences for a young man literally fighting for his life on the borders of Afghanistan. But he fought for 6 weeks. He didn't win a Victoria Cross, which is what he really wanted. I think, if we had a good look at it, his exploits at Shahi Tangi on the 16th probably merited more than the mention in the dispatches that he got. The senior officers were in another part of the valley, so didn't see him doing his acts of daring, but he clearly was very brave and risked his life for his fellow men. But he returned to London soon afterwards, and he thought, well, I've got to cash in on this. First of all, he was absolutely furious to find that his 15 articles for the Daily Telegraph had been published without his name on them. The byline was by a young officer. And this particularly annoyed him because his great rival for fame and fortune was a gentleman called Viscount Fincastle, the correspondent of the Times, who did actually win the Victoria Cross for an action at Mingora. I'll just quickly run through the remaining slides here. As you can see, the fighting was very intense and hand to hand. At one point, Churchill writes that when he ran out of bullets, he and the tribesmen were throwing rocks at each other. This is how close the fighting was. No quarter given. This was really serious fighting, and despite the military superiority, a lot of casualties on both sides. And again, I think that has a lot of resonance for today's conflict, where for all our military superiority, British, American, and other NATO soldiers have often found themselves in very intense engagements on the front line. Viscount Fincastle, winner of the Victoria Cross, correspondent of the Times, whose dispatches, of course, were nowhere near as good as Churchill's, but at least they had his name on them. So Churchill decided to write a book, and his first book, The Malacan Field Force, was published in March 1898, and set him on the path to literary glory, the Nobel Prize for Literature, as well as a very lucrative career as a journalist and author. We can imagine, after Fincastle had won his Victoria Cross, how annoyed Churchill was to find that Fincastle had also decided to write a book. And the really sort of wonderful part of young Churchill is one minute he's being very brave, the next minute he's crying, the next minute he's throwing the most appalling temper tantrums because he can't get his own way, and his date, what he regards as his date with destiny, is being interrupted. But there's a good ending to the story, because the book was published in March 1898. Thanks to the rigorous promotional activities of his mother, everybody in London was aware that the young subaltern writing the dispatches for the Daily Telegraph was one W.S. Churchill. The Prince of Wales, a good family friend, wrote a letter to young Winston congratulating him on his dispatches, on his book. But the really important thing is that Lord Salisbury, the new Tory Prime Minister, invited Winston to Downing Street. So for the first time, Winston Churchill, aged 22, enters Downing Street, the Prime Minister's private rooms, to meet the Prime Minister. And of course, this is where, many years later, we see a far more well-known Winston Churchill directing a very different kind of military operation. But again, the bumptious nature of this man, who's desperate to make a name for himself, grasp any opportunity, is evident in this brief exchange with Lord Salisbury. The old Prime Minister says to Churchill, and for those of you who know Victorian history, Salisbury played a rather important role in destroying the political career of Lord Randolph. So Lord Salisbury says to Churchill, "Well, lovely to see you, young Winston, and well done on your book. Anything I can do for you, just let me know." And most young men of that age would just say, "Well, thank you, Prime Minister, thank you very much." But no, not Winston. He says, "Well, actually, there is something to do for me. I want to go to the Sudan and fight with Lord Kitchener in the campaign against the Mahdi." Now, Lord Kitchener had read Churchill's dispatches in the Telegraph, as I mentioned earlier, and basically put a ban on any more subalterns writing impertinent nonsense about military campaigns. So the last person he wanted fighting in the Sudan was one Winston Churchill. So you can imagine his surprise at the Battle of Omdurman the following year, one of the last great British cavalry charges, when he's riding into battle and looks across and there's one W.S. Churchill mounted on a grey riding into battle. So Churchill was never one to miss an opportunity. And of course, as a result of what he achieved in Afghanistan, the Sudan, and more famously in the Boer War, he eventually achieved his great ambition of becoming a politician, entering politics, and the rest, as they say, in history. Churchill left Afghanistan, though, with mixed emotions. As I said, he was only there 6 weeks. That made him an instant expert. He wrote a book about it. He approached Afghanistan like many young officers of his generation, with a very gung-ho attitude. But after the bitter experience of fighting, I think he had a very more nuanced approach. And certainly his last words on the wisdom of waging war against the Afghan tribesmen is something we might want to reflect on a bit more today. Fighting in Afghanistan Churchill concluded, financially it is ruinous, morally it is wicked, militarily it is an open question, and politically it is a blunder. And I think the words and thoughts of Winston Churchill echo through the centuries, the decades rather. And that brings my talk to an end. Thank you.
Thank you, Con, for that very illuminating and amusing talk. And I'll open up with the questions and then throw it open to the rest of your audience. So I guess, beginning where you left us, because I think that as far as I know, you probably are less skeptical than Churchill might be about the Afghan war, the present one.
Well, I certainly supported the strategy devised by Generals Petraeus and McChrystal in 2009. And in fact, the idea for writing this book came from talking to the generals in Kabul 4 years ago. And when they were drawing up their counterinsurgency strategy for dealing with the Taliban, they were looking at the Malakand field force and the experience of the British in the 19th century. And General Petraeus said to me at the time, a bit like the British, you can't kill and capture your way out of this conflict. You need a political settlement as well. And the conflict I've written about in the 19th century was finally resolved when Lord Curzon did a deal with all the tribes on what is now the northern border of Pakistan. And that deal lasted until about 2001. And my concern is that while there's been a great military effort, the same amount of investment has not been made in the political sphere. And I fear that when we end combat operations this year, if there's not a political settlement, then I fear that the country could easily revert to its former state.
Yeah. So the Lord Curzon, this was 1902, the frontier crime regulations and the right for the tribes to sort of be left alone. But I mean, how was it resolved specifically in terms of the tribes on the frontier?
It was a very simple formula, really. Curzon, who before he went into office with Salisbury's government, had made a private trek round the Hindu Kush, had gone to Kabul and met with Abdur Rahman. He'd actually went to a costumier in the Strand and bought the most florid theatrical military dress he could find to impress the Afghan emir. And it was a very successful meeting for that reason, because he came in covered in braid and all kinds of funny bits of ribbon, and the Afghan emir thought he was the most wonderful man. And in similar vein, he approached the tribesmen. But his formula was very simple. If you do not pose a threat to the British Empire, we will leave you alone. We'll give you autonomy. And actually, when you drill down to the offer on the table to the Taliban, really since 2001, is, if you do not pose a threat to Western security, if you do not harbour terror groups that are going to do us harm, we will leave you alone. I mean, that was the formula even before the military intervention in 2001. It's still on the table at Qatar for the talks. The problem is I detect a lack of political will, both in Washington and Europe and the other NATO nations, to actually put enough pressure on the players locally to make this happen.
Yeah, and I mean, there's exhaustion in every country, including this one. I think the Afghan war is the least popular war in American history now, and it was obviously that was true in Britain even long before. So let's throw it open to questions from the audience. If you have a question, raise your hand and wait for the microphone. Do we have a microphone here yet? Yes, somebody's coming in with a microphone. Start in the back. If you could identify yourself. And
Thank you. I'm always fascinated by British officers in the Victorian Army. Was Churchill on active service in the 4th Hussars when he writes General Blood? And if so, does the 4th Hussars just say go? And then does he ever have command of troops either at Omdurman or in Afghanistan or in the Boer War? Is he just there kind of just to write reports? Thank you.
Very good question. Again, if you read through Churchill's exploits, thank goodness he was never actually in command of anyone. He was rarely in command of himself. I mean, you have this sort of character who's always in a hurry, very kind to his men. But to answer your question, he was on active service with the Queen's 4th Own Hussars in southern India. He had to get special permission from the regiment's colonel to go and join General Blood. When he set off, it was on the basis that he would just go as a correspondent. But because of the casualties, he was then seconded as a serving fighting officer. And he fought with the 15th Sikhs, from memory. So he was a serving officer with all that meant, writing his dispatches as a sideline. Again, at Omdurman, he got himself seconded as an officer because they'd suffered casualties, but he was as a fighting man. Of course, a lot of his fellow officers who served with him were sort of rather irritated, to say the least, by his antics, and just couldn't understand why he couldn't settle down with the regiment and go pig-sticking and all the other exploits and not make a nuisance of himself. And on one occasion, in the officers' mess after dinner, they actually put him under a sofa and sit on it to shut him up. And he wriggles free and says, no one can keep a Churchill down. On another occasion, at Malakand, he shares a tent with another fellow officer who later recorded that Churchill talked all night and said that he had no fear of being injured or killed, so long as he wasn't shot in the mouth and couldn't talk. So you get these wonderful insights into this man with this great self-awareness and determination to make a name for himself, even if it's meant upsetting all his contemporaries.
Con, how did you walk us through the reporting for the book in terms of the reporting in the UK and then also on the AFPAC border?
A lot of the sources I've used for the book are the regimental archives and the Indian Office records. The Indian Office, the British Civil Service, kept very detailed reports of all the campaigns, ventured frequently off to meet with the tribes and make reports on the tribes. A lot of the tribal leaders came sort of into voluntary exile in India and wrote their own accounts. So there's quite a wealth of material, and of course the Churchill archive itself is a wonderful place to spend a lifetime, really, just reading. I mean, there aren't many 20-year-olds that you'd really want to spend a day reading their writings, as they call them. But with Churchill, it is just very compelling, even at that age.
Where is the Churchill archive?
At Cambridge University.
And what about on the AFPAC border? How did you proceed with that?
What I did with the AFPAC border was I spent a lot of time in Kabul and Afghanistan and in Pakistan, travelling around with the NATO mission in Afghanistan, and on the Pakistani side, I went with the Pakistani military. I also got to know a number of very senior Pakistani civil servants who administered the Malakand district. I don't know if you've come across him, Peter. Dr. Humayun Khan was in the 1960s the district officer for Malakand, and he writes this golden age when the Curzon settlement still applied. When Pakistan was formed, they didn't mess with Curzon's arrangements of autonomy for the Pashtuns. They left them alone. And he told me this wonderful story of how Queen Elizabeth in 1964 visited Malakand and sent a cable to Winston Churchill, who was still alive, saying, "I'm standing at the seat of one of your greatest triumphs, Mr. Churchill." And just to sort of give you an idea of the passivity of this region at that time, Prince Philip spent the day duck shooting in the Swat Valley. But Dr. Khan told me that, for the decade or so that he administered these areas, if you left the Pashtuns alone, you didn't have any problem with them. And he's still alive and living in Islamabad. And he says that somehow, and you've already seen this process starting now in Islamabad, a method has to be found to sort of get the Pakistani Taliban, as they're called, the Pashtun community, to sort of lay down their arms and sort of settle back into that peaceful existence. But it's a very big ask. I mean, you know this area better than I, Peter.
Tom Ricks?
Hi, Tom Ricks. Thanks for that wonderful talk. Do you think this first book of his would have been published had it not been for the influence of his mother in London?
That's a very good question, Tom. it was Jenny Churchill who persuaded the editor of the Daily Telegraph to publish his articles. And of course, once those articles have been published by the Telegraph, and I read a couple of extracts. They're pretty gripping reading, actually. So I think once those articles were published, it was easier for Jenny to approach a publisher. But it was Jenny. Winston had the idea of writing a book, but it was Jenny that secured the publisher. And again, the publisher was a family friend. But one thing led to another. But I mean, again, looking at the Churchill's letters of the time, he was so determined to make something of his experience that I think he'd have self-published if he hadn't found a publisher.
Did Jenny Churchill come off as an American when she was in Britain? Or did she, I mean, how did she present
Well, young Winston was very much aware of his New York family connections. And in fact, when he was at Sandhurst, he spent his summer holiday traveling to Cuba, where the Cuban Civil War was underway. He actually was accused by the New York press of being a British spy. And the accusation wasn't that wide of the mark, because before he set off for Cuba, again using his family connections, he met with the director of British military intelligence, who said in his very sort of laid-back British way, well, if you do a few sketches of the battlefield, young Winston, that would be very helpful. And he did some sketches of said battlefield, which were passed back to London. Of course, the American government at that time was very anti the Spanish colonialists. And it was a very interesting time. And through Jenny, Churchill got to meet some very New York high society, and even visited West Point, his rival military academy. And he had a very dim view of the American cadets, who he thought were far too culled by the laws and didn't have a rebellious spirit like the Sandhurst cadets.
this gentleman here?
Thank you. Given Churchill's aversion for casualties, Abraham Avidor, retired Foreign Service, given Churchill's aversion for casualties, could you explain the rationale for ordering the Gallipoli campaign in 1915 as First Lord of the Admiralty? And also an earlier episode in South Africa where he barely managed to escape a Boer capture. He was rescued by a farmer by the name of Mr. Howard, and after he was rescued out of the country, he became a member of parliament. That helped him a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, well, the Gallipoli story is very complicated, but all I would say on that, I mean, certainly Churchill didn't envisage the mass slaughter that took place at Gallipoli. The whole purpose of the Gallipoli campaign was to get away, to open a new front, and get away from the mass slaughter taking place on the Western Front, which he thought was absolutely appalling. And of course, he went back to the Western Front as a lieutenant colonel once he was forced out of office, and spent 6 months in the trenches with the men. And if you read the regimental archives of that period, the one thing he took great care on was to enhance the protection of his men and reduce casualties. So, but the whole Gallipoli adventure started as an attempt to break away from the mass slaughter of the Western Front and open a new front which would take the pressure off the Western Front, get the Germans to swing round and support the Turks, and therefore bring the war to a speedy conclusion, and spare further casualties. And of course, it didn't work, and it was a terrible disaster, and he paid the political price for it. And as for the farmer whose name I can't remember, Churchill took great care to protect his identity so that he wasn't open to reprisals. And it was 20 or so years later before he actually admitted who the farmer was.
Eamon?
Good morning. Eamon Gearan, currently with Johns Hopkins SAIS, formerly a stringer for the Daily Telegraph in the Middle East.
All right.
I wonder, does history record what young Churchill thought of the Curzon settlements, and would you care to speculate on what Churchill, the elder statesman, would make of the attempt to come to a settlement in Afghanistan today?
Thank you. Well, remember, when Churchill was 24 or so when Curzon, who was much older, made the settlement. And they knew each other socially, and Churchill was rather jealous of Curzon because he was very well educated and very clever and very successful and had a proper title and wasn't a sort of a distant branch. So, and again, there was a very spirited correspondence and conversations between Curzon and Churchill over this particular matter, because despite what I read at the end there, Churchill still thought that the best way to deal with the Pashtun community was give them a jolly good hiding and make them see sense. And he had some quite lively discussions with Curzon in Calcutta to this end, to the extent that Curzon advised Churchill to keep his conversation short because nobody really had the will to listen to these great rants. So what would he make of today? Well, I'd have thought after what happened in September the 11th, he would have supported the military intervention. I think he would have seen the difficulty of prosecuting the campaign and achieving purely military ends. But of course, given his sort of no surrender approach to the Nazis, you wonder whether an elderly Churchill, because you look at how Churchill got the Indian independence campaign so wrong. I don't think his judgment on Afghanistan today would have been quite so infallible. This lady here.
I'm Patricia Wrench, also retired from the U.S. Foreign Service. Is there any indication yet of the terrible depression, his black dog, that we read about later? Did you come across anything about that? Is this the beginning of it, the stress of his trying to achieve? And
He was prone to get very frustrated if he couldn't get his own way, but he was just such a bundle of energy, and he was just determined to succeed in so many ways. And one thing I haven't mentioned, which is quite an important feature of his life at this point, he was a very active and very skillful polo player, and he helped his regiment to win the Polo Cup, the first time a regiment from southern India had ever done so. So he spent a lot of time playing polo, and it was made even harder that he dislocated his shoulder in Bombay. When the boat docked, he was in such a hurry to get off the boat after 3 weeks at sea. He jumped off, and the boat went one way and his arm went the other, and he dislocated his shoulder, so that he had to play polo with one arm strapped to his side. And also in conflict, in battle at Omdurman, he rode into battle against the Mahdi supporters with one arm strapped to his side. Very, very brave. So he was not overcome by fits of depression. There was just so much going on. There was a lot of cantankerous jumping up and down when he didn't get his way. But in terms of succumbing to the black dog, I think that came later after his fall from political favour.
Any other questions? Tom Ricks, and then Greg. It's a very bad sign, but I know everybody asks their questions.
Hi, that last Afghan quote you quoted about his views on the war. When did he say that, and does it appear in your book?
When did he say it? He says it from memory. I mean, I have to check the reference in the book, and it's indexed. But from memory, he says it in a letter to his mother. Actually, no, sorry, it's in the Malacan Field Force. It's in the concluding chapter of the Malacan Field Force. He has a concluding chapter where he sort of wanders around the houses, really, whether it's a good thing or bad thing, but that's probably the most compelling quote, and certainly makes for a good discussion point.
Greg Mitchell.
Thanks very much. I'm Garrett Mitchell, and I write the Mitchell Report. And I want to, you've been curiously reticent about comparisons between the Talib then and today. And I wanted to know whether that is because you learned enough in researching this to know that the circumstances are substantially different, from the 1890s than they are today, and I'm talking really about the character of the people involved, or whether it's sort of in your nature
To be reticent?
yeah,
can
to
answer
be
that.
reticent about such things. And as a sort of corollary to that, I wonder if in the research and writing of this book, you came to a changed point of view about the current military situation in Afghanistan. There was something that gave you some insight that you might not have had you not done this.
Well, the Pashtun, I mean, I've stated over the Pashtun issue because I'm here primarily to talk about Churchill. But clearly I did a lot of research on the Pashtun community, the whole code of Pashtun and what it means, and why it is that the same tribes and villages that Churchill was fighting against are now involved in the modern conflict. But I mean, I wouldn't portray myself as an expert on the Pashtun community, but I've spoken to a lot of Pashtuns who really know that part of the world very well. And I mean, the Pashtun community is a very quarrelsome, warlike community in the first place. I mean, the Pakistani army today hesitates in appointing them to senior positions because they go on holiday and off to their tribes, and then they get involved in some tribal dispute and get killed and don't come back. Having said that, as most people know, the ISI, the Pakistani military, 50% of the senior officers are Pashtun. So the fundamental issue is that they don't like people interfering in their affairs, whether it's NATO, Americans, Pakistanis, British. They are very sort of nationalistic, I suppose, in their sort of outlook. And one of the sort of disadvantages of the intervention in 2001 is while we primarily went in there to root out Al-Qaeda, we attacked their protectors, the Taliban, who all came from these Pashtun tribes. The code of Pashtun means that even today, having extended the hand of friendship to Al-Qaeda, it's very difficult for Mullah Omar and everybody else to say, well, go on your way now. I mean, that comes right down to the Pashtun code. Has it changed my mind? Yeah, I think, like a lot of defense editors, I was probably a lot more gung-ho about the military operation when we started, particularly after it was so successful in 2001. And what it's taught me, and spending time with the Pashtuns and sort of traveling around the region, what it's taught me is that there is no military solution per se to this problem.
This lady over here.
Elaine Soreo, Foreign Aid Through Education. I really appreciate your presentation. What, given history repeating itself, do you see for the next time? We've had 3 times in Afghanistan in the last 117 years. So when will the next go around be?
Well, when Al-Qaeda come back, which could easily happen. I mean, I saw Ryan Crocker in Kabul a couple of years ago, just before he stood down, and he was warning then that unless we get our exit strategy right, Al-Qaeda would be back. And he had this wonderful quote. He said, well, we've killed all the slow and stupid ones. The next generation will be very smart and very determined. So, but if you look at the history of Western involvement, America, Britain in the Victorian era, we've always gone in with a rather sort of altruistic aim of siding with one tribe, the good guys, the good tribes against the bad tribes. But what happens, and we're seeing this with the Karzai today, the moment we get in there with the good guys turn on us. And there are no good guys in Afghanistan anymore. So I just think we have to be very, very careful about going in. But when there is a sort of clear and present threat to our security, we don't have that much choice. And certainly, you know, if you read of the history of Britain's involvement in the Victorian era, London clearly thought, certainly in the 1830s, that the Russians were about to set up camp in Kabul and pose a direct threat to the security of the British Empire. And certainly in the modern age, the early presence of AQ and bin Laden in Afghanistan was deemed a similar threat. So if such a threat rears its head again, it's going to be very difficult not to get involved in some way or another. But Peter, Peter's sitting here very quietly. I mean, he's also a global expert in all this.
Well, thank you, Colin, for that really great presentation. Colin will sign books for anybody who would like them signed, and let's all give him a round of applause.
Thank you.